Hey everyone, Seth at Hub City Vintage, and today it looks like we're going to continue the trend from last week with another 150 meters of vintage diver history. Now it's absolutely no secret that my love of bare bones tool divers has a way of maybe being overly represented in our listings, and you can bet that most days I'm either wearing, working on, or looking for great Seiko divers. But every once in a while, I can't help but admit there are too many other great divers that I should also be talking about. You've heard me say that the Seiko 6309 7040 Turtle is hands down my favorite, and that is absolutely true. As I'm recording this, I literally have one Suwa model in hand and another on the way, both of which will shortly make their way to the HCV stage. So what vintage diver that's not a turtle, not even a Seiko, could possibly be worth putting together our first non-Seiko video? I'll give you a hint. In May of this year, a pretty faithful reissue hit the market, and to my surprise, it's actually mechanical and not an eco drive. Alright, that's less of a hint and more of probably a dead giveaway. And yes, the new one deserves the warm reception it's enjoying, but for me, there's nothing like the original Citizen Challenge Diver. Quite possibly the most widely sought after 150 meter diver Citizen ever created, the 520110 is the toughest tool watch you didn't even realize you needed. Just how tough? Well, a man named Neil Blakers was strolling along Long Reef Beach in Australia one Saturday afternoon in 1983 and spotted what looked like a rock with a watch dial rolling in the surf. It turned out to be a challenge diver exactly like this one, except nearly completely covered in barnacles and coral. He wiped away the debris on the crystal only to realize that the watch was still running. He ended up returning that one to Citizen's home office, where it was determined that it was likely underwater for almost 2 years. Now that one currently resides in their museum. Looking at both of these watches side by side, and both in as-found condition, is probably the fairest way to make a good comparison. I haven't done anything to either of these watches. This one literally just came out of the box, and I just picked this one up from an individual just a couple of days ago. And today we're just going to take a look at the physical aspects of each, and I think next week we'll do a head-to-head of the technical aspects. As far as I know, both of these watches are one-owner watches before they came to me. The gentleman I spoke with, who I got this one from, has had this watch since new, and it has clearly been well-loved. The crown has stripped out. I've got a new one on order, but it no longer secures. It's kind of just loose there on the crown tube. It won't screw down. And so he pretty much stopped wearing it. And this one I bought from a guy who oddly, in a crazy twist, I talked to this guy who had this watch listed locally in my area and went to meet him, and turns out he was my next door neighbor from 20 years ago. I don't even know what kind of miracle that was from the watch gods, but I had no idea that I would be talking to my neighbor from 20 years ago when I went to pick this watch up. And this was his dad's watch, who was a lieutenant commander in the Navy who bought it new in 77 or 78 and wore it throughout his naval career all through the 80s. And of course, when he retired from the Navy, it went into a safety deposit box and has basically been there ever since, and clearly was very well taken care of. You can see, this is even the original crystal on this watch, and there's just some scratches there. So I think this one will really just clean up nicely. I may even try to salvage this original crystal and just do some polishing there and see if we can't get those scratches out. But let's just start with the case. The Seiko case, I think to me, this really says a lot about where Seiko was at this time. The 6105 8110/19, that really was sort of an avant-garde design for them at the time. That's a giant, 44, 45 millimeter asymmetrical case. You have the sort of, when we start to see the C case designs from Seiko, and that is where they basically start with a solid piece of metal, and rather than a watch having independent lugs, there's really just metal removed in the shape of lugs to create that space. It's not like a more classically designed case where you see these nice, crisp, well-defined independent lugs. It's less of an independent lug and more of metal removed to make space for a strap. I really like that design. Seiko did such a great job with that. And of course, for a watch this large at 44 millimeters, they did a really good job of flaring the case sides, rounding them off, making them very smooth. And it's got a nice curvature here. It's very comfortable on the wrist. Crown is nicely recessed at 4, so you don't have that large crown digging into your wrist at 3 o'clock if you wear this watch on a regular basis. And of course, nice flat back, rounded edges on the case back. It's very comfortable to wear. One of the reasons that I like this watch so much. I also love the bezel. This sort of double stacked knurling. It's got a nice ball bearing design, so you get a firm click in either direction, bidirectional bezel. But a great case, and I love that design. It wasn't like anything else you were really seeing at that time, whereas Citizen stayed with a more of a traditional design and crown at 3. As I mentioned, with this one at 4, it's much more comfortable to wear, though I did strap this one up when I first got it, and it is absolutely not uncomfortable to wear at all. The crown screws in quite far, and it doesn't really dig into the wrist. I'm one of those people who wears the watch way far down on my wrist, in front of the wrist bone, so if there's going to be a comfort issue with the crown, I'm going to know about it. Citizen didn't go with, at this point, now this is I believe this watch was, 1977, and this one is, Citizen does their serial numbers a little bit differently than Seiko does. So you have the first number represents the decade in which it was produced. Here, that's going to be 7 for 1977, and then the month is done in the next 2 digits. 04 means April of that year. So April of 1977 versus the Seiko Suwa Turtle from March of 81. So this would have been likely one of the very last Suwa Turtles to have rolled off the production line, because it was in 1981 that Seiko moved production, part of production anyway, to Hong Kong and Malaysia. So you started to see that Suwa logo go away on subsequent models. Very late Suwa model, very cool. But I'll be the first to admit, as much as I love this Citizen Challenge Diver, clearly I think that where they got their inspiration is pretty clear. There's a few different things going on here where you can see inspiration from other brands and other watches. Obviously, the dial is nearly a dead ringer for Seiko's 6105 8000 or 8119. Large, raised framed, polished framed markers, and that Citizen used a bit of a brighter, luminous, I shouldn't say brighter is probably a bad word, but it is much greener. And of course, you can see that the hands might look similar to one of the big boys, that Mercedes style diver's hand. But one of the reasons that Mercedes logo is there, what they call the Mercedes logo, is because having a window that large with luminous doesn't provide much support, and you run the risk of the lume literally just falling out of the hand there. So less a design choice than it is bracing and support for the luminous behind there. And I love the little triangle on the end of that Mercedes style hand there too. But you do get a broad minute hand. I love the shape of that minute hand. I love that the hour and minute hand are completely different. They look like they could have come off of 2 different watches. And then of course you have a sweep here, a nice long sweep with is there even a tip on the end of their sweep? I don't think that there is. Whereas Seiko has a nice long pointer on the end of their sweep. Yes, I think that the Citizen literally just ends in that lollipop window there. So kind of neat, something you don't see very often. Most times you see a lollipop hand, it's going to end in something that's going to give you a way to more precisely point at a second if that's something that you need to do. Now, Seiko, with their dial, of course, everything on this watch, after the 6105, they moved away from raised markers. You're going to have this, of course, matte black dial with just painted markers, no frames, and the luminous sits within these painted white hour markers. But I do love this design. I think it's one of the most nicely balanced diver dial designs out there. I love these big bell markers at 12, 9, and 3, and the big split. I've heard that Seiko chose that shape because it looks like a diver's flipper, which also, how could you not like that? You've got your 2 flippers here, and then we have a spare set out here at 6 and 9. And of course, these nice, large, round markers in the middle, and I just love the way that shape comes together. It's a very cohesive design, and I think it looks great with these hands that we're seeing for the first time on this particular model. The 6309 was the first time we see these large Seiko hour and minute hands, very broad, this nice big pointer arrow here, almost a harpoon looking minute hand. And that would be a design, of course, if you are still following Seiko divers. This is a design that's still around today. It's a part of Seiko DNA. I doubt that they'll ever completely get rid of that design. It's very well put together and just large enough that you don't have to have extra braces there to make sure that you have support for the luminous. The Citizen is a date-only model for this particular diver. Now, I know that there's another diver that's similar to this one. I think it's a later model that was a day date. I think it was even marketed as such, but Seiko 6309, that is going to be a day date for sure. And for me, I don't necessarily use the day of the week as often, and I've made mention before that for me, a diver, I don't even care if there's a date at all. I would almost prefer to have nothing there. I like the dial to be as perfectly balanced as possible, but because you have such a large marker here at 9, this day-date window doesn't look out of balance, and Citizen did such a great job here framing the date and even adding a little luminous plot there and the excess left over by having the date moved in quite a bit, and so it wouldn't have been a great balance to have nothing there. They enlarged that frame and put a nice little luminous window there on the side that basically shares a frame. Now, this particular model is from, as I said, 1977, and the very next year in 78, they made a few changes, whereas this Citizen badging is stamped into the dial. It's pressed and then basically polished over on top to get that nice bright polished Citizen logo that you see there. The following year, they got rid of that and actually did an applied badge. Actually, it's how many letters are there in Citizen? 7. There are 7 individual letters that are riveted into the front of the dial, and of course, there's a slight change to the date window there as well. It's its own separate frame, and then there is a separate little marker outside of that date frame, but otherwise the watches are nearly completely identical. As far as the bezel, as I mentioned already, the Seiko has a click bezel, ball bearing design, bi-directional, and Citizen has chosen to go with the friction style bezel, very similar to the Seiko 6105 prior to this one. So, I have to believe that Citizen was pretty much very well taken with the Seiko 6105 and a design they thought, hey, that shouldn't be over so soon. We'll implement some of those design aspects into our watch and keep that going. I do like that Citizen has, like Seiko, and this is a good tell for anyone who's looking at these watches. You'll notice that there are marked printing for all of the minute markers. So a lot of the aftermarket bezels that you'll see will only go to 10, maybe only go to 15, and then the rest will be blank. You won't have these other dots, but a genuine Citizen bezel insert will have the dots go all the way around the entire circumference of the bezel. And as much as I love this large pip from Seiko on the bezel, it's very easy to see, and especially if you've ever had one of those reloomed, it's pretty bright. The newer Seiko models, starting with SKX, right after 7002, they got rid of that big pip, and now there's a much smaller one in a basically same size triangle. I don't think it looks as good. I like the larger pip with a large triangle. But Citizen has still a pretty large pip here, and that's another good tell for looking at a genuine versus an aftermarket. You'll see that the pip on aftermarket bezels looks much more like the Seiko here with just a flat, and it's usually not even doesn't even have an acrylic lens in front, just as a piece of luminous that sits right on top of the dot there. But they did a good job of even framing the pip. That's one of the little tiny details that I think really sets this watch apart. If you look closely, you can see that the luminous pip in the bezel is actually concave. It sits in there like a bowl, and there's a black frame around that, and then an acrylic lens over top of all of that. And you won't see that on aftermarket Citizen bezel inserts. Most of them, in fact, you might there might be someone out there producing those now, but in my experience, they don't look they don't look anything like this one, really, and they're very easy to spot. And this is a detail that really stands out to me as a way to spot a genuine Citizen bezel insert, and something that they didn't have to do. They could have just put any old pip in there, but it's a good detail, and it looks really good as well. Also on the inside, so the turtle has a separate chapter, and that is a separate piece altogether. It sits below this sort of there's a chapter retaining ring that sits inside, and then there's a crystal retaining ring that snaps down over top, whereas Citizen has their, just like the 6105, a printed silver minute chapter, and then of course there's just a polished Rehaut in there beyond that. And rather than having this crystal snap ring that sort of presses the crystal down against the gasket inside, Citizen's divers by this point had a gasket much more similar to later Seiko models, even the 7002, where you have sort of this plastic resin gasket that the crystal is pressure fit into to ensure water resistance. So, and as I understand, the earlier 150 meter divers from Citizen, I think it's a 68 reference, not the year, but that's the model reference, has a quite complicated situation going on for how the crystal is held in place. I think there's some spring involved and a crystal retaining ring and a separate gasket, but this is sort of just your one and done gasket that surrounds the outside of the crystal, and the crystal is pressed down into it. And clearly with Mr. Neal's story, it is sufficient to keep it pretty safe in the ocean, rolling around for at least a couple of years. Maybe not at 150 meters of depth, but it certainly serves its purpose. Now, the Citizen is 40 millimeters across compared to the Seiko's 44 millimeters, so quite a bit of size difference there. But honestly, I think that the Citizen, it wears much bigger. You know, that you have this protruding crown. It gives it, it almost makes it appear as though it has a larger diameter than it actually does. And these lugs, they're just so beefy. It really wears like a much larger watch than just 40 millimeters. I think it's 40 on the dot. Let's pull out the old calipers here and double check, but I'm almost positive. Yep, you can see 40.6, whereas the Seiko, I think, is it's 43.9 by my calipers today. But yeah, so 44 versus 40. When I sit these two watches side by side, it doesn't look like there's a 4 millimeter difference in the size of these watches, but it really just comes down to these flared case edges here, and this is going to be just a little more of a streamlined look. So as the Citizen on its own, I really think they took the best aspects of some of the other divers that were available and even added their own touch to give really just a great, unique watch that is a great standalone. You know, I think that they borrowed just enough to prove inspiration, but didn't ape the designs so much that it just looks like their version of something else. And I think a lot of watches, watch brands tend to do that even today. There are several brands out there who just literally adapt the designs that you see from other brands. Of course, we wouldn't even, without the Rolex Submariner, which is the pretty much the foundation for what all divers watches would and have become. You're going to have those design cues that are built into almost all dive watches. But I think that it's the details that make the difference in what makes a watch worthwhile. And I certainly think Citizen did a great job. Even the small changes they made over from 77 to 78, really just cueing in on the nuance and some of the details, making it an even better watch. As far as the profile here, there's some great curvature in the lugs here. Once again, this is going to wear as comfortably as the Seiko does. Maybe even more so. There's a bit of an even stronger contour than what you see on the Turtle. That's the crown side, and on the other side, it's much more visible. It's a very pronounced curvature there, so that's going to hug the wrist. If you have a smaller wrist, you have a big flat watch, it's not going to be as comfortable as it could be if there were some nice contouring there. And I love the dip here in the corner of the case, sort of just to be sure that really only all that's hitting the top of the wrist is the case back. They've removed some metal here to make it a very comfortable design, and of course a nice flat case back with all of your pertinent info there. And Seiko as well. They have this is after the Silver Wave. Prior to the CT2 Moss, we see that Tsunami logo for the first time, and then of course that's sort of shelved until the introduction of the Turtle in 76, 77. But a Seiko icon. There's really not a lot going on this case back, and that doesn't really, you were not even going to feel this sort of medallion, this inset medallion on the Turtle case back. Sits on the wrist very comfortably. Both screw down case back, both screw down crowns. I do like that the Seiko has a much more recessed crown. You can see there are what we could call crown guards here, and when this crown is completely screwed in, you can see there's only about 2 to 3 millimeters of that crown that are actually protruding outside of the case of the watch. So even if that were positioned at 3 o'clock, if you could still have it that deeply recessed, I don't think you'd feel that much on the wrist. Whereas the Citizen, this is, if we completely screw this one down, I like to turn backwards before turning forward to sort of make sure that it's a good practice if you're ever worried about stripping out your crown tube. It happens. The crown or crown tube threads, forcing those threads into a cross thread will definitely weaken the threads and certainly make it to where eventually it's going to wear and you're not going to get a secure fit. One of the reasons I'll have to replace this crown here, I'm sure. So start by going backwards as you push in, and you'll feel a bit of a click as the threads align, and then you can properly screw it down. But back to my original point, even with this one screwed in all the way, almost the entirety of the crown still protrudes outside of the case at about, I would say, 4 millimeters. So if that is something that you're sensitive to, the crown digging into your wrist may be something to be wary about here. But again, I did strap this one on just because this is the first one I've had like this in the flesh. I've seen a few others and got to hold a few others, but this was the first one that was mine that I could strap to my wrist and enjoy for a bit. And I did not notice any comfort issues. Lastly, I will say regarding the bezel of the Citizen, I do like the design here that it's very deeply inset into the case. With the Seiko, it sits right on top of the case and gives it quite a bit of height. Let's see what we have as a total overall height for both. For the Citizen, and of course, remember it has a bit of a domed crystal. We have a 13.4 millimeter height. And the Seiko, if we can get an actual measurement here, is actually 12.7. It's actually a shallower, under 13 millimeters, a shallower profile than the Citizen has, but I think again this has a flat hard Lex on top, and the crystal here on the Citizen, much like the 6105 crystal, is a shallow dome. Actually, it may be flat. If it is domed, it's only very slightly. I think it's just the way that light is refracted there that almost makes it look like it has a curved crystal. But you can see from the top there's really not much in the way of a dome appearance to the crystal at all. Well, that should certainly make it easier to polish those scratches out of there. And of course, the red date wheel, again, another nice little touch that sort of sets the Citizen apart. You don't see a lot of red date wheels anymore. Years ago, that was something that was a little more common. In fact, the Rolex roulette date wheel, black and red, actually has you may not know this, that's actually a very functional aspect to the date wheel. It's not just for design's sake. The red and black date wheel came about as a result of post-World War II rationing in Britain. They didn't have much after World War II. That pretty much broke that country completely. and everyone was on rations. And to make it very easily, whether you were even or odd days, red or black days for your rations, Rolex included that part of current culture into their date wheel, and that is where the roulette date wheel came from. So when you see that next time, you can remember that that's a result of history and wartime. And so Rolex worked that into their date wheel, and even now you'll see sometimes roulette date wheels or just all red or all black. But I haven't seen a red date wheel in so long. I was surprised to see this one be all red. It's really just a nice little touch and a pretty much monochromatic layout here. It's nice to have a little bit of color to just stand out and make it that much more legible. And I think that's just about it. As I said last week, we'll get into some of the technical stuff about these watches, what sets them apart movement-wise. And I think if there are advantages to the Turtle design-wise, I still, even after having my first challenge diver in hand, I'm still going to say, I don't think any watch, just about any watch, could change my mind from this being my favorite. I think it's just about a perfect watch. But I think it's fair to compare these two head-to-head because both are Japanese. And at this point, like I said, this is still a Suwa build in its entirety. And Seiko and Citizen both, being on an island, being in Japan, they were, at least at this point in time, both still completely vertically integrated as far as manufacturing goes. They made everything for their watches. And so, you get nice tolerances that way. You get precision fits for parts, and that's whether they be external or on the movement. And that makes a big difference when you're working on these. No alterations ever have to be made to parts like with some of the older Swiss stuff where parts were being pulled from every which direction, case here, a crystal there, a bezel there. Even different components of the movement could be pulled from different manufacturers. That was not the case with Seiko and Citizen. Both made everything for their watches at this period in time. So I think that these can be very fairly compared. And so when we look at the movements next week and see the differences there, I think you'll be a bit surprised at some of the capability here with the Citizen. And of course, the CT309 is certainly bulletproof. These watches will run for just about ever, and you could not make a mistake in buying. I can say for certainty this watch, but we'll take a closer look at the Citizen movement as well and see what you think from the quality of the build of the movement. Regardless, they are both great watches. Both great designs, and I don't think you could be upset owning either of these watches. Whatever your taste in tool dive watches, there's no way that both of these don't just appeal to you and your baser instincts as to what a great tool diver should look like, should feel like. You will not be disappointed in either of these, both of which will eventually be for sale here. So keep a lookout for that. And I hope you've enjoyed a chance to compare, two great Japanese dive watch icons, and that you will come back next week to learn even more. You can like and subscribe below so you don't miss anything. You can also join our Patreon community where $7 a month gets you exclusive content, sneak peeks at our upcoming inventory, and a chance to win giveaways. And as always, thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.